This is what's called the attribution question, trying to work out cause and effect in observed changes in climate. And it's a difficult one because climate is notoriously noisy. I mean, you have warm years, cold years. We're having a relatively cold year at the moment, and everybody's saying, has global warming stopped? Again, we don't, as scientists, take a single year seriously. We know that there are fluctuations in temperature. We have warm years, we have cold years. It's not something you can draw any conclusions from. What we have to look at are trends over decades and compare these with the trends we simulate in climate models. The reason we have to use climate models is because we can't do controlled experiments on the real world as we would like to do, say, on a piece of physical apparatus in order to understand how it works. So on a lab bench, you can change something and see what happens. In the real world, greenhouse gases are going up. We don't have the option of seeing how the past 30 years would have been if we hadn't increased greenhouse gases. But we do have that option in a computer. So we perform our experiments in silico, as they say. We perform our experiments in the computer, and we try and simulate how the world was, with everything included, human influence and natural influences, and then we take out specific influences. We take out human influence, we take out natural influences like solar variability and volcanoes, and see what difference it makes. And what we find is you can't explain the way temperatures have changed over the past century without a combination of both human and natural influences on climate. And you certainly can't explain the warming we've observed since the 70s unless you assume that most of it is due to human influence on climate, rising greenhouse gases. So if we hadn't interfered with the climate, then what we probably would have seen would have been a warming in the early part of the century, essentially as the climate recovered from those big volcanic eruptions in the late 19th century. And then, as we had a series of further volcanic eruptions since 1960, and again in 1982, and again in 1992, we had a sequence of volcanic eruptions which will have cooled the climate again. So we would have seen changes over the century with natural drivers alone, but they would have been overall pretty neutral. A small warming at the beginning of the century followed by a modest cooling. So conditions today would be, in that hypothetical climate where we hadn't interfered with it, pretty close to back what they were in the late 19th century. So you can see that what we're actually experiencing is very different from that. We don't have Dickensian Christmases that often anymore. I think many people sort of worry about it, thinking that the whole planet might be doomed, or the entire, you hear people like James Lovelock talking about the whole human race being wiped out by global warming. I look at my kids and I look at the way people behave, and by and large, people are pretty adaptable and pretty resilient. And so I don't worry that we are going to all get killed by this thing. I do worry that our children are not going to thank us for giving them the headache we're going to give them if we carry on the path we're following. Because if we don't get out of this, they will have to. And every decade we postpone doing anything about global warming is another 100 billion tons or so of carbon into the atmosphere, and we're that much closer to the sort of climate where we really can't predict where the warming will stop.